Have you ever been in a conversation where you felt truly heard? Maybe a friend leaned in, nodded at the right times, and asked thoughtful questions. You walked away thinking, they really get me. Now, contrast that with another experience. You're talking about something important, but the other person is staring at their phone, muttering, and clearly not paying attention. Even if they don't say anything negative, you feel ignored and maybe even invisible. That's the power of listening. It's not just about the words we hear, it's about connection, validation, and trust. Psychologist Carl Rogers, who developed the idea of active listening, argued that empathy and genuine listening are the foundation of meaningful relationships. Without it, communication collapses. The example is, think about when a child tells their parents, "I'm scared of the dark." If the parent responds, "Don't be silly," the child feels dismissed. But if the parent says, "I understand, the dark can feel scary. Let's find a nightlight together," the child feels safe and valued. The difference isn't in hearing the words, but in listening to the emotions behind them. We all like to think we're good listeners, but let's be honest. How many times have you pretended to listen while secretly planning what's for dinner, or nodded along while scrolling TikTok? That, my friends, is what communication scholars call pseudolistening. And trust me, we've all done it. The problem is people can usually tell when we're faking it, and once they do, the trust in that conversation starts to break down. For example, imagine your roommate says, "I'm stressed about finals," and you reply, totally," while your eyes are glued to Netflix. Not very supportive, right? Now compare that to looking at them in the eyes and saying, "Yeah, finals can be rough. What class is stressing you out the most?" One response shuts the door, the other opens it. So today, we'll dig into what real listening looks like, the different styles and types of listening, and some of the most common barriers, like pseudo-listening, that we need to avoid if we want stronger connection. In communication studies, listening is defined as the multi-step process: receiving, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. Scholars emphasize that listening is not passive. It is an active, skill-based practice that requires attention and engagement. One well-known theory by Andrew Woven and Caroline Cockley highlights 5 types of listening: discriminative, comprehensive, therapeutic, critical, and appreciative. Each plays a role depending on context, from distinguishing sounds to understanding lectures to emphasizing with a friend. Here's an example. In a classroom, a student practices comprehensive listening by taking notes on assignment details. In a counseling session, a therapist practices therapeutic and empathetic listening to validate a client's emotion. Those are not the same skill, but both require intentional effort. So in this session, we'll explore not just the what of listening, but also the how, strategies for interpreting messages, types, and styles of listening, common barriers, and practical games to sharpen our listening skills. So, let's start with what is listening. Listening is more than just hearing sounds. Hearing is physiological. Your ears pick up sound waves. Listening, however, is psychological and relational. It involves paying attention, interpreting meaning, and responding appropriately. For example, if someone says, "I'm fine," you hear the words. But if you're really listening, you notice the flat tone or the forced smile and realize they're not fine at all. You would notice the emotion and the nonverbal signals. And what is the listening process? The listening process includes several steps: receiving the message, interpreting it, evaluating it, and responding. It's like a chain. If one link breaks, the whole process suffers. Imagine a professor give detailed instructions for a project. If you only receive the words but fail to interpret the structure, you might miss the deadline or misunderstand the requirements. So what is the strategy for interpreting messages? The first step is actually determine organization. Recognize the structure, the main ideas, supporting details, or chronology helps prevent confusion. For example, if you're following a TED Talk where the speaker says, "I will give you 3 reasons," this kind of statement lets you track their argument. And the second, attend to nonverbal cues. Notice the tone, body language, and expressions. A friend says, "Don't worry about it," but sighs and looks away. Clearly, they do want you to worry. The third, paraphrase. Restate what you heard in your own words. For example, "So what you're saying is that the deadline is Friday at noon?" When you're not sure about something, you can paraphrase it and say it again in your own words. Fourth, ask questions. This is to clarify and show interest. For example, that sounds stressful. What part of the project worries you the most? And let's talk about the different types of listening that we have mentioned earlier. The first is discriminatory listening, which is about distinguishing sounds. For example, did you say bank or tank? The second is appreciative listening, which is about enjoying music, speeches, or stories. For example, with 2 fans bond over a favorite song, that is actually appreciative listening. The third is comprehensive listening, which is about absorbing and remembering instructions. For example, students taking notes on assignment requirements. The fourth is evaluative listening, which is about judging credibility. For example, questioning whether a rumor is true. And the last is active-empathic listening. Listening with empathy. The example is responding to, "I'm stressed," with, "That sounds overwhelming. Do you want to talk about it?" And these 5 are the types of listening, and there are also different listening styles. The first listening style is called action-centered, which is about efficient, focusing on the task itself, and also content-centered, where we pay much more attention to the details, which is detail-oriented analytical listening, and also time-centered, which should be brief, concise, efficiency-focused, and finally people-centered. The focus of this is about relationship and empathy. For example, in a group meeting, an action-centered listener says, "What's the next step?" While a people-centered listener would say, "How do you feel about this plan?" Both are valid but reflect different styles and a different kind of focus. What could be the barriers, the obstacles to effective listening? The first is the pseudo-listening that we mentioned earlier, which is about pretending to listen while distracted. And the second is monopolizing, which is about shifting focus back to yourself, because you make this conversation about yourself, not your communicator. The third is called selective listening, which means you only listen to the parts that interest you, but ignore the part that is really important to your communicator. The fourth is called defensive listening, which means taking neutral comments as criticism. That means you feel like you're being constantly criticized by your communicator. And the fifth is called ambushing, listening only to attack, which is even worse than defensive listening because you feel like you're ready to have an argument, a very fierce argument with the other person at all time. And sixth is called literal listening, ignoring emotional context by paying to the textual information only while ignoring other signals like nonverbal, emotional. And the final is called biased listening, which means only listening or hearing what fits your beliefs. For example, a partner says, I feel distant from you, and the response is, I've just been busy. The content is heard, but the emotion needed is totally ignored. So here is a game that I designed for you that you can play on your own. What I'm going to do is that I will read you a short story aloud, about 1 or 2 minutes long. You must listen carefully, don't take any notes. After the story, I will ask you detailed questions. Let's see how many details you can remember. So the story is as follows. Yesterday afternoon, Sarah went to a little cafe near her office. She was wearing a blue jacket because the weather had turned chilly. At the cafe, she ordered a latte and a slice of carrot cake. While waiting, she glanced at the cafe's old wall clock, which showed it was already 3:15 p.m. After finishing her snack, Sarah walked to the Sunset Hotel, which was just 2 blocks from the cafe. At the hotel lobby, she met her friend Michael, who was dressed in gray suit and carrying a black briefcase. They chatted for a while about an upcoming conference before heading to the park for a short walk. That is the end of the short story. And here is the question. What color was Sarah's jacket? What did she order at the cafe? What time was it when she looked at the clock? How far was the hotel from the cafe? What color was Michael's suit? And the last question is, where did Sarah and Michael go after visiting the hotel? The first answer is actually blue jacket, and the second is that she ordered a latte and a carrot cake. The third answer is 3:15 p.m. And the fourth is 2 blocks. The fifth is the gray suit, which is the color that Michael was wearing. And the last question is the park. You can play this game with your friends with different kind of variations and make it even harder, like add more details. So the point of this game is to remind us that listening requires effort. It is not a passive activity. It is actually an active behavior. And you can't truly listening while multitasking. Presence is key. To summarize, listening is an active process of receiving, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. By using strategies like paraphrasing and questioning, by understanding different types and styles of listening, and by avoiding barriers like pseudolistening and defensive listening, we can improve not only our communication but also our relationships. Listening is not just about words, it's about connection. When you truly listen to someone, you tell them, you matter. You matter to me. I value what you're saying and I value you. Thank you for listening, and I hope you leave today with more aware of how you listen and how you can listen better.